So anyway, thank you both. Maybe just a gigantic question for maybe not alluded to in both your talks, but is this, which is just the larger issue of the kind of correlation or parallels of scientific curiosity and aesthetic curiosity. So maybe for Andrew, how are they similar? And for Naomi, what are the aesthetic considerations for your scientific research? I know those are gigantic, but I noted about 4 or 5 times that Naomi used the word visual or visually gratifying. You used that a lot, and I think probably for all of us, we kind of got it when we saw like the graphs with different colors, So anyway.
Right. Well, I think in choosing an organism to study, I confess, the whole world is out there, but I probably gravitated to insects, certainly to butterflies, but then ants because of their fascinating behavior, and now moths because of their crypticity and fascinating behavior. But aesthetics surely comes into it. I figure if you're going to spend your whole life studying something, it might as well be something that you like looking at it. I'm sorry to trivialize it, but on the other hand, I think it's
you probably
of course it's a motivator.
Probably there are many other scientists who are also compelled by what they're looking at every day, whatever, even if it's like the guts of the birds, and that led you, Andrew, to kind of keep going, like what's inside there, and then, So,
No, and that one point to that I'm just curious about with mutualism too is like I'm not sure whether as the artistic, this idea of this being an art project, then I'm the subject who's the creative agent, but I wonder to what extent why am I collecting all of these seeds kind of obsessively? I wonder to what extent I might not also even be being parasitized by these plants, as opposed to,
being mutualized.
Yes. Maybe it's a mutualism in one sense, but maybe it's a parasitism. Like there's something compelling, there's something aesthetically compelling about these creatures from this natural history perspective, I suppose. There's a different, but also but what's interesting is I'm also was trained as a zoologist, first in butterflies and then ants also. So I don't know why I'm so interested in plants right now. So that's kind of interesting. And that gets to your question, about, I think, if I were working as looking at that in terms of the scientific aesthetic, I think I would feel obligated to research it and be thorough about it in a very certain kind of way, but I can engage in certain kinds of play, certainly with these systems that I couldn't if I was really taking it on as in a scientific project versus an artistic project. And that's where I'm trying to advocate for this idea of the natural history of being sort of the hybrid compromise, where it can still be informed by these certain kinds of forms of knowledge, like the evolutionary anachronism, but it's still driven and motivated still also by like the personal and with things that allow for play or paradox, but those are things you wouldn't be allowed to engage in the same way.
It seems, Andrew, you're much.
I love it. I think play is important.
Yeah.
Well, I do. I don't think, and I wish that all students would explore. That's a pretty deep passion to rear out all those seeds because it's a lot of work, but. I think.
Well, it seems like there's definitely a parallel for the artists in the audience, with that kind of obsession with that, you get up the next day and, you must do whatever it is, collecting or whatever. It just, you end up with 2 different outcomes or different kinds of outcomes.
I have a slightly more philosophical feeling about the mutualism aspect too, and the seeds manipulating Andy's behavior, or I don't know how many of you saw the cover of Science when they had the dog looking out very lovingly out of this cover picture, but the article inside was about how the dog is tapping into oxytocin responses in humans, so to manipulate the host or the owner by eliciting the same sort of responses that you have from raising children, or
Right.
gazing deeply into each other's eyes, or this is a viewpoint that is very common for people who study mutualism or cooperation, is that it may be better viewed as a reciprocal parasitism. So with the kind of salesmanship and escalating coevolution of one party manipulating the other, and then the other one getting over those barriers and now manipulating back. And I do find it's hard to say no, that's not what happens, because in fact we see evidence all over the place in cooperative systems of manipulation taking place. But for my philosophical note on this is one reason why I very much like looking at evolutionary history and looking at phylogenetic trees, because when we look at something like the phylogeny of the Lycaenidae, we find that the explicit parasitism, that is, those species that are eating the ants, they fool the ants chemically to be taken into the nest, where they either eat them or fed mouth to mouth. Those are taxa that are evolutionary dead ends, in the sense that they result in a reduction of species, and over time they look like they're on their way out. And so it makes me feel optimistic that the ones that appear to be mutualistically associating with each other, where the caterpillars provide food and the ants provided protection, those are the ones where we see these big gradations taking off. And so from that evolutionary evidence, I would say, no, okay, I understand that we can view this as reciprocal parasitism, but I'm not so cynical about it, because I actually think that in most cases it is mutualism. And in some instances, it can turn to parasitism, but actually, on balance, we often see mutualism resulting in a very creative diversification.
And reinforcing,
Yeah.
right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So we've talked about, Andy and I have talked a bit about these. These are the sorts of things that interest both of us, I think.
So I actually have a question, or maybe a related question for you, Naomi, which is, how do you feel, or how do you respond to Andrew's kind of sort of shift from, pure science to kind of this kind of art making out of science?
Oh, I'm just great.
Yeah.
Really? Be honest.
Yeah, no, sure. No, I think it's great. Except that, there is a difference, which is that I want him to catalog all those plants that come out of the gut, so that we can look at them. I mean, because there's quite a lot of scientific evidence there that's interesting, and few people have taken the time to do something like that. Look at what germinates better when it comes out of a bird gut, and also how that may vary depending between individuals and across species.
Right, yeah.
So that would be my difference. But in terms of the idea of making art out of it, I think it's great.
I would invite the audience, maybe if anybody has a question or comment, because I don't want to run too late. So Megan is right over there. She's bringing a mic to right here.
Okay. Oh, thank you both. That was a really interesting presentation from both of you. I was wondering, Naomi, you're speaking to a kind of uninformed audience about biology, and one thing I was really curious about with the two of you is that, you're using a set of data visualizations that have their own kind of vocabulary that has evolved greatly. What we use now versus 10, 20 years ago is totally different. And so that is a kind of transmission of a set of it's evidence, it's also, but a set of imaginaries too, because we have to sort of fantasize about how many ants there are, and the kind of history of this, and the kind of evolutionary biology that's occurring, and that seemed to be a little bit analogous towards Andrew's visual propositions, which again point to a set of imaginaries for the audience to kind of engage with.
I totally believe that. I think for pedagogy, or to actually teach, I always use a lot of imagery, or I try to imagine so I was thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to talk about lycaenids and ants and how maybe the caterpillars are manipulating the ants, but nothing replaces actually seeing the caterpillar tapping on the mandibles of the ants. I mean, this is, then you go away with that, you remember it. So it's, to me, it's incredibly important that interplay of the real natural history is essential. And it's funny, but there are many students. I have many students who will not do this, and we have practice talks about the research that they're doing, and everything is sort of stylized or put over in a little box and it's sort of strangleized, without a sense of nature. And so I try to kind of break that down, because I think that people will not go away remembering what the story was if they can't sort of see the story. So, but how that interfaces with art, I am a very literal person.
Yeah.
Is it hard?
No, I think you have to do it to record.
Hello?
Yeah, good.
Could you both reflect on this concept of making the invisible visible in terms of your science practice and your art practice? Because I think, well, at least from this talk, I picked up that there's a really clear relationship in terms of science practice and art practice there.
Do you want to start?
I think that's true. I don't do very well with things that I can't see. That has meant that my entry into molecular biology has been a little slow, because I tend to do experiments over and over again just to make sure that I can believe them. But if I can't see it, it's hard. And one example with these ants and the bacteria, we spent an awful lot of time trying to get a technique called FISH to work, where it's a fluorescence technique where you can visualize the bacteria and where they're embedding in the guts of the ants. And this was terribly important to me, even visualizing the fluorescence of how many bacteria are there. To me, it's very important, but. And I also think that it can contribute to the science, because who expected? We didn't expect. I know John didn't expect such orders of magnitude of difference in numbers of bacteria between the ones that were very functional versus the ones that may just be traveling through, as it were.
I mean, yeah, I think it connects to that idea too. That certainly, I mean, maybe it's obvious to say, but that artistic and scientific practices share a deep sense of curiosity, which is like making things visible. In part, is about sort of the underlying why. Like, what's the invisible thing that's happening? What's the sort of underlying causality? Like, and that might be matter in motion kind of causality, or it might be emotions and affect and semiotics. But there are these things that are running through underneath, right? What you otherwise take for the surface of things if you don't look closely or if you don't inquire. And so it makes me think, I don't know if you've seen, there's this really great primatologist at Louisiana State named Povinelli, and I saw him, I'm interested in his papers. He does stuff around chimpanzee cognition. But I saw this documentary recently called Surviving Progress. Have you heard this? Or it's kind of a strange documentary, but one thing, the documentary starts with Povinelli showing his chimps that he always compares adult chimps and 5-year-old human children. But there's this certain kind of L-shaped bar that you can prop up, and if you put it on the circle and balance it, you get a banana or you get an M&M, depending which species you are. And but then he has a trick one that's weighted at the end, and so whenever you try to balance it, it falls over. And and one thing that turns out to be the case is, and I don't mean to be very speciesist in this, but this is where he goes with it. But I think it's fundamental, this question of underlying curiosity and visibility. Is like, the chimpanzee will give up after 2 times, but he's like a human child will like continue to try to stand this thing up for like an hour. And he's like, and anyway, then his narrative comes on to be like, that's what's fundamentally different about, and I don't know if I agree with that, what's fundamentally different about humans versus chimpanzees, but I think but there's something about, clearly even the gesture of doing this, there's this other visualization that's probably internal, but trying to make this other invisibility make sense, that's happening in the way that this child continues to practice with right? It almost makes a tool out of the thing that's confounding the child, that the chimpanzee isn't doing it in the same way, I would argue. But I mean, I think that might get to that question of the visibility.
I know we're both very interested in this notion of private channels.
Yeah.
So some of the work going on in my lab now is looking at the wings of butterflies and moths, and looking at wavelengths that we don't see ourselves. So scanning across all the taxa, so a really broad survey of the distribution of UV reflectance, fluorescence, long wavelength, so off the end of the red that we can't see or into the near infrared. These are things that really fascinate me right now, because I'm guessing that it will also tell us something about perception, insect perception, that we are unaware of because we don't have it ourselves. I think it's a theme that runs through all the things I've studied, because
That's where I wonder if, because scientific instrumentation is supposed to do that, right? Basically extend the visibility or perceptivity, right, of what you're limited with. The instrumentation sort of extends your Umwelt, or your perceptive sphere, right? And I do think that you could make a metaphorical argument that the artistic, the project, the artwork is an instrument, right? Maybe not instrumentation, but the instrument by which you are again trying to, right, expand that cone of perceptibility. But in a more nuanced way, it isn't simply about detection. I think, again, it's also about sort of affect and evocation. It's about evoking also from within, not just the detection from without. But I think the same idea applies in terms of this question of the instrumentation or the sensitivity, right? Because the aesthetic means it comes from the Greek for awareness, and so it's trying to potentiate these different kinds of awareness. I think that is also in common that you don't see in other disciplines that aren't art and science in the same way. The real focus on potentiating awareness, or the sensitivity towards, again, that underlying invisible that you mentioned, I think is crucial.
I think we have time for one more, because we are running really late. One more question.
How about two? There's also a girl.
Okay.
Hi. Andy, I think at the end of your talk, you were talking about how, I'm going to do a poor job paraphrasing this, forgive me, but I think you said something like evolutionary history can be thought of as a series or sequence of very unlikely things. Mm-hmm. And it dawned on me that all of the trees in Naomi's talks are basically giving evolutionary histories. Do you, Naomi, ever think about what each of those branch points, where you get a divergent, two species come off of one? Do you think about that as a point in time? Do you think that an event happened somewhere on the planet? Do you ever imagine that and think about what that would have looked like?
There's a way of plotting phylogenetic trees. It's called 10,000 trees, where because every one of those trees is it's a hypothesis, it's an estimation, where you run the algorithm, over and over and over until you get some confidence interval on that node. But there's a way where you can visualize that, so that when you see those branches, you can see that it's actually made of a composite of many branches that sometimes went one way and sometimes went another. And to me, those are a little bit more exciting than the deterministic branch point. It's more the
So each scientific paper would be 1,000 pages long to show every tree.
I guess that last person with the mic.
You said you showed a video of a caterpillar getting milked by the ants, and you showed the tentacle.
Yes.
And I was wondering if the tentacle kept on popping out, or if it was a new one that got harvested by the ants, or if it was just the same one.
That's a very good. It looks like that's what it's doing, but no, the different species have, some of the tentacles are very sharp and brushy, and some of them are flabby, and that one is sort of flabby, and I don't know why. We've looked a bit at the tentacles, and they secrete compounds that are pheromones that disperse in the air, volatile compounds. And I've always thought that they mimic ant alarm pheromones, so that they keep the ants very excited. The ant will sort of look up when the tentacle comes out, and sometimes the ant will try to bite at it, but Amazingly, to this day, not for a single species, the compound secreted by those tentacles has not been identified. So, and that's not for want of trying. People have tried. It's just whatever they're making. It's a very small amount.
But it doesn't ever give away its tentacle. The caterpillar keeps its tentacle.
No, the ants do try and bite at them. But the caterpillars have very thick skins, and those tentacles are pretty tough. So it's
All right, I think we're going to end here formally. I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you both for just terrific,
Thank you.
great stuff. So just to let you know, we're taking a break for the summer. Our next event will be September 15th at the Decorative Museum. We're calling it Between Wonder and the Monstrous, with artist Sean Foley and Harvard Dream researcher Deidre Barrett. This is part of a program for the exhibition curated by Sarah Montrose, currently on view at the Decorative, called Overgrowth. And then I'd like you to save the date for our fundraiser November 3rd, which is called Charmed Science. We're going to be sort of doing magic and science in some way at the Microsoft Nerd Center. And if you join us in the lobby, we'll have an informal reception, and both our speakers will still be here to talk with everybody. So thank you for coming.